I asked you guys for your Saints Row hot takes, and today I'm going to go into them and tell you whether I think they're a fact or they're complete whack, so let's get straight into it. So our first one's from Texas, and he says, the term "this is not Saints Row" doesn't make sense anymore. Not only are there more games with the newer wacky style, but by a lot of people's logic, Saints Row hasn't been Saints Row since 2008. You see, when people say this is not Saints Row, what they're talking about is what Saints Row was founded upon, the ideology Saints Row had going into the series. So when people say Saints Row 3 or Saints Row 4 isn't Saints Row, they're talking about what Saints Row used to be at its core, which is a gang, gritty game. Now, I know a lot of people kind of have different opinions on when the fall off of what Saints Row actually is. Essentially, the problem is, just because there's a newer style of game, it doesn't mean that's what defines Saints Row for what it is. Unfortunately, the foundation is what defines Saints Row as Saints Row. This would be like taking Call of Duty, having 17 games that are first-person shooters, and then one day making every single game for 18 games in a row a third-person shooter. That doesn't make it the true Call of Duty experience. That's not what Call of Duty is. So just because there are more games in the newer style that people dislike, and people say aren't like Saints Row, it doesn't mean that that newer style is Saints Row now. Yes, I do understand that there are more games in the series that are the newer style of Saints Row, and I personally love them. I love all the Saints Row games. But I do understand where people come at when they say it's not Saints Row, because they're not saying it's not a Saints Row game, they're saying it's not that Saints Row foundation they fell in love with. This is why there's such a split in the community. There's different eras of Saints Row, and unfortunately when people say it's not like Saints Row, they're usually going, it just doesn't feel like the Saints Row they fell in love with. I hope that kind of makes sense. So whilst I do think your take is an interesting one, Texas, I can't fully agree with it because the foundation of Saints Row is what it should have been built upon. Ginger has a really good one. Carlos's death was used purely for shock value. It was barely even a sad death considering his character had absolutely no development whatsoever before his death. In my opinion, they added it just to catch you off guard and give you a reason to hate the Brotherhood for lack of other ideas. So I think this take is really interesting from Ginger here. And I do agree. Wholeheartedly, I think the way Lynn's death was done was honestly just a lot better. And the problem with Carlos is realistically, he's in like a couple missions and cutscenes. This is one of those times where Carlos needed more screen time to become a beloved character. I'm going to compare this to Sleeping Dogs. Spoiler alert for Sleeping Dogs if you haven't played it, it's old as hell though. When Jackie dies in Sleeping Dogs, you go through the entire game as him being your best friend. It's soul crushing. The problem with Carlos is you basically knew him for the first act of the game. He got you out of prison, you did a couple missions with him with the Brotherhood, and well, that's it. Personally, I think they should have killed him off a lot later in the game, maybe even after the Brotherhood storyline, so we had a lot of time to actually develop our relationship with Carlos, or they should have just given him more screen time. So I personally think that that's a good take, but I know a lot of people will disagree. But I will say that I do think Carlos's death added a lot to the Brotherhood gang, and without that, realistically the Brotherhood would have been kinda mid. King of Fools says, I like Saints Row 4. Me too. That is a based take. Small Smudge says, Saints Row series should have ended after 2. That is a whack take, I'm sorry, but what you are trying to say is that the games after 2 should have been handled differently. Realistically, if they'd have ended the franchise right at 2, we'd be left on a cliffhanger with our mouths open going, what just happened? What you're trying to say basically is that 3 should have built more upon 2, and that is a good take, but I do think if you're like, Saints Row should have just ended after 2, imagine how many people would have been pissed at that. What a waste of a franchise. Samburger with Cheese says, we should have got AOM 2 instead of Saints Row Reboot. I like the reboot, but you can tell they're tired of doing gang stuff. The problem is that Volition have this exact same take. They planned to do AOM 2, but unfortunately the sales weren't there, so they couldn't. This is one of those situations where it's not even a take, it's more just like facts. So it is definitely a factual take. Unfortunately, Volition did want to do AOM 2, but they never could because they didn't get the sales on AOM 1, so that's why we ended up with a reboot. So we should realistically have gotten an AOM 2, but personally, I actually prefer the reboot to AOM 1, so I'm actually happy we got the reboot. Unless AOM 2 would have expanded upon what the original idea of AOM was supposed to be, if you watch Flippy's video, I probably wouldn't have been that interested, being honest. Master of Gaming says, Saints Row 4 is my favourite game in the franchise. The gameplay is really fun in my opinion. Zinyak is my favourite villain in Saints Row because he's a villain you love to hate. The DLCs are my favourite in the franchise and I love the characters. I could go on. You know what? I think that's a really good take. I think Saints Row 4 was a really fun game, and if you're in it for the just fuck it, I want to have fun playing Saints Row approach, yeah, this game does it the best. See, my favourite Saints Row 2, but I always put 4 underneath 2, which I know upsets some people, but 4 is just so much fun. I know we only have one enemy antagonist, but he's so fleshed out and so charismatic, he's really cool. So yeah, I think that's a good take. If Saints Row 4 is your favourite game in the franchise, I will never be one to be like, oh, that's a bad take. Because honestly, I think that's one of the better takes you can have, as much as people don't want to admit it, because Saints Row 4 is just pure fun. It's just good-hearted fun, lots of vibes, lots of callbacks. It's, again, as they described it themselves, a love letter to the franchise, with all the references and callbacks and stuff. I love the game, personally. So yeah, that's a good take. So Anonymous says Saints Row died after Saints Row 3, and I don't fully know where to stand with this take. Because yes, the highlights of Saints Row, the best stuff Saints Row has was definitely in those first couple games, but 3 and 4 also sold really well, so like the franchise didn't die off until I'd say maybe the reboot. Realistically, those games performed well, so if you're just talking about like what you like in Saints Row dying off, obviously that's a good take because that's preference based. But if you're just like, oh yeah, Saints Row died, like fully died off after Saints Row 3, then you couldn't be more wrong because realistically, Saints Row 3 and 4, to my knowledge, performed pretty damn well. Tear Golden Gars says every game in the series pre-reboot is good, including Gather to Hell. To me, this is pretty whack. I'm sorry. I hate to break this here, but I don't understand how a lot of people would be like, oh, Gather to Hell was a great game, but the reboot is bad. For me, the reboot has a much better map, way better customization, way better mission structure. I mean, it actually has proper missions. But realistically, the only thing in Gather to Hell I'd say is actually better than the reboot is perhaps its combat and its characters. For the rest of it, I'd probably give it to the reboot. Driving was more fun, the map was way cooler, you could do a lot more stuff in the reboot, the sandbox was a bit better. I like Gather to Hell, but it's probably my least favourite Saints Row game, so I'm a little bit biased on this. But to me, that's a bit of a whack take. I think if you like Gather to Hell, you have to give props to the reboot, because realistically, in my opinion, the reboot is a better game. We have one from Buster Keaton Rules, okay? Saints Row 2022's only major weak point is the lame story, except arguably the protagonist, but a better story would have made them work. The map is amazing, the ability to buy empty lots and build Saint-controlled businesses from scratch is something I've been wanting to see since Saints Row 2. I disagree. I'm sorry. You know me, I love some Saints Row 2022, I built my channel on it, but there are a lot more weak points to the game than that, realistically. Like, sure, the story's not great, but you've also got really janky aiming, no interiors on the map, low amount of cribs, no diversions. There's a lot more that makes Saints Row 2022 a worse package. To me, I would agree that the story is its biggest weak point, and if the story was more in line with the earlier games, people would have accepted the game a lot more. However, I do think that there are some other major weak points. So William B says something similar, being like, outside of characters, cringe dialogue, and the base plot of the story, the reboot is not a bad game. It's not the best by any means, but it's better than people gave it credit for. Blah blah blah, customization's better, etc, etc. And the game was near on par with Saints Row the 3rd in my opinion. I fully agree with this take, wholeheartedly. I think people do not give the reboot the credit it deserves, and I think it's probably on par, in my mind, with Saints Row 3. I think this is a really good take. I'd love to do a game versus game where I compare the two, because I think they're really similar games, and I'd say, yeah, they're pretty much on par for me. Also, he puts Snatch and Escort are both fun activities and definitely should be brought back in future Saints Row games. That is a bad take. Nobody likes Snatch and Escort. Nobody. That is a bad take. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you everyone for submitting your takes. I loved reading through them. Let me know if you want to do some more of these. They're always quite fun to do. If you want to comment some more, just comment on the community post I made about the bad takes. And perhaps we could do a part 2 at some point. So yeah, thanks for watching everyone. See you soon.